Hi, and welcome to InfoSec Pros. I'm Kayne, Field CISO at Hyperproof, and I'm joined today on the show by Ryan Niemes, Head of Security at Helix. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thanks, Kane. Great to be here.
And because this is a live stream, if you've got a question for Ryan or a question about Helix or about Hyperproof, please drop it in the comments on either LinkedIn or on YouTube, and we'll actually take those as we go. But at the top, Ryan, I just want you to please tell the audience a little bit about yourself and also about what Helix does.
Sure, happy to. So, I'm as Kane mentioned, as you mentioned, I'm the head of security at Helix. I've been here for about 3 years now. I've been in the genetics field on the whole for about 13 years, and before that, I was in DoD contract work. I worked for Cisco for a couple of years, and I started my life as a Unix administrator.
You and I
And
have that in common, it turns out. Which version of Unix was your first version of Unix?
well, I I started off with Slackware in my dorm room.
Oh, Slackware. Okay, cool.
Hmm.
Sunos 2.4 here for me. Very, very corporate-y. Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
With a
that's pretty
Sparks
fun.
disk. Yeah, yeah. Well, it was an upgrade from the VT 102s that some of us had to deal with,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Well, today we're going to be talking about cloud. We're going to be talking about regulatory. We're going to be talking about your expertise and your background, especially in a highly regulated environment where I'm sure you're dealing with HIPAA. But I know you've got a cloud environment and also I imagine you've probably got an on-premises environment, that being the way genetic stuff works. You probably have to have a lab and stuff like that. So
correct.
how are you really approaching the integration of traditional security controls inside of your cloud environment?
Well, it's a great question, Kane. It's definitely a challenge to do so. Um, the best way that I've found to approach it really is to understand the cloud environment as best you can and try to find tools that fit within that more so than tools that you would traditionally use in an on-premise environment, and rather than just porting them directly over to the cloud environment. The the it changes so rapidly, and
Mhm.
at first you could actually see where you might be able to run like an antivirus solution on an EC2 instance in Amazon or something like that. But now we've gone almost completely serverless. So we're dealing with Fargate clusters, ECS, dealing with Lambda. And so those tools don't work anymore. So we have to use new things that are provided natively within, for our example, AWS. So like guard duty, for example. So it's very important to understand how those work and how you can use those and tune them if it's even possible to make sure that they're working properly in your environment.
Okay, and do those also span on premises as well, or do you end up operating in two separate security stacks?
You really do wind up operating with two different security stacks in our case. Um, we do have a lab, like you mentioned. We have a lot of instruments and IoT types of devices, and we do run traditional sorts of security tools on those. So EDR, Nessus scanning, that sort of stuff.
Okay, and just for those who are unfamiliar with Helix, tell us just a little bit more about what Helix does.
Sure. So we've gone through a number of evolutions over the years, but our current market space is we deal with large healthcare providers, and if if the healthcare provider wants to provide genetic testing and genetic counseling services to their customers, they would partner with a company like Helix. So you go into your healthcare provider, they take a blood draw, they send it to our lab, we sequence it and we return results back through your EHR that you're familiar with. A lot of people on the call probably use the EHR that we all use, and uh, we're also able to then provide researchers access to that information as well if people opt into that. So there's a lot of privacy implications there as well.
I could see that absolutely. Okay, cool. So that's kind of a good framing for your at least the high level of your environment and some of the context. And before the live stream, you and I had been talking about incident response, and I want to ask you about that. So, from your perspective, thinking of your large network environment you're operating, what are some of the common challenges that your organization or just organizations in general face when they're implementing their incident response strategies, and how can those be overcome?
The constant change in the environment, I think, is probably the biggest challenge. AWS, GCP, Azure, whatever it is that you guys are using, or whatever anybody's using, is always changing, and there's always new features coming out, and you have to understand how those can be exploited. So it's almost an impossible task. So the only way, really, I've found to keep on top of it is just to simulate incident response activities on a fairly frequent basis. Some people call it like threat hunting types of activities, where you say, let me just look and see in this account what's going on, what can I find, and frequently you'll find something that is of interest, and you can pull a thread, and you just wind up learning more about a service, and you realize that something is totally normal. But now you've obviously got that in your knowledge base of normal activity and not scary activity anymore.
Okay, and you say you're doing that on a fairly regular basis, that you're actually using threat hunting across your environment?
That's correct. Yeah.
Well, that's
Um,
exciting.
yeah, and I wouldn't even consider it like we're not a big enough organization to do like real threat hunting, but it's more along the lines of let's examine what's going on with this environment. We have several AWS accounts. They all have different purposes. Look at the workloads that are in there. Look at the logs, look at the VPC flow logs, try to experiment with the native tools that are inside those environments that you can gain some visibility. And you'll invariably find something. It's kind of frustrating in a way because everything is so different and it is so new.
Mhm.
But it's also pretty exciting when you see when you're used to traditional on-premise equipment, uh, you can get a lot more visibility, I think, in Amazon or any other cloud provider.
That's exciting. And so then how do you take those learnings and apply those to your incident response strategy?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I mean, the findings, we generally try to come up with some recommendations and some roadmap items. So I'm loath to give any particular examples, but you may
Wouldn't ask
find
for those, but
that,
just in general.
yeah, but generally speaking, you would see something and write it down as a finding and say, well, what can we do to mitigate this, or what can we do to change policy wise on an endpoint or in our cloud environment that would prevent this from being an issue in the future. So we do that quite frequently, and it's kind of amazing what you come up with and find when you just start to um, pick up the rocks around the environment.
And I can imagine that also probably involves working with other teams. So,
Yeah.
because you just can't do these things in isolation, especially if you're making policy or implementation changes. So, what role would you say that cross-departmental collaboration plays in really enhancing an organization's incident response preparedness?
It's key to have good, solid relationships with the cloud team, the engineering teams, compliance. Whoever else you can have good, solid relationships with, because no, you can't go it alone for sure.
Mhm.
And one of the ways that I've tried to do that in the past is just using my background as a previous systems administrator, right? So I had to keep things up and running. I didn't really care necessarily about security like I do now. So I understand the challenges with, okay, well, we need to patch this device, or we need to take it offline, or we need to do something to it. So being able to relate to the environment and the controls that, and the I guess just the constraints that other teams are under,
Mhm.
really helps to build that rapport with other teams.
So when you're thinking about those constraints, then does that inform the way that you're approaching risk mitigations and risk
Yeah,
management? Because I want to tuck into this one because we've
yeah,
previously seen the head of security or the CISO role be perceived as they're responsible for the risks of business systems,
mhm.
cyber risks, which I still don't believe exist anymore.
No.
Where do you come down on that, on your role in advising or on owning or selecting controls to mitigate risks?
Well, certainly you're right. I mean, the security team and the security officer do not own the risks for the organization. I don't believe our role is there to escalate as appropriate,
Mhm.
um, be aware of the environment, be aware of the risks, and recommend controls. And ask for resources to mitigate those risks. Um, and as far as like addressing those risks in a way that makes sense,
Mhm.
that is clearly a big challenge. You pick any topic, but like one that comes to mind currently is vulnerability management,
Okay.
right? Traditionally, it's been, there's lots of vulnerabilities that come out every year,
Hmm.
and the easy button is to just patch everything, right? But that's kind
I
of
don't know if that's the
impossible.
easy button. Yeah, that's kind of impossible there, like you say.
Exactly. So you have to come up with other ways to mitigate the risks to the environment from a vulnerability perspective. And that again comes down to understanding the truly your environment, what your real exposure is, and being able to work with the teams to get things on the roadmap to, you know, put private endpoints in your VPCs, or make things not exposed, or really identify the risks to the environment. We're starting to look at EPSS scores currently and see
Okay.
where
And for the
our
viewers who don't know what an EPSSS score is, I love this acronym soup we live with, but what does that mean if you don't know what an EPSS score means?
yeah, I don't remember the exact details of the acronym, but it's like exploit. Um, it has to do with the exploitability of a vulnerability. So the
And that's under
same team,
CVEs and CVSS, Common Version Scoring System version 4, or Common Vulnerability Scoring System CVSS 4.0, right?
I don't really know whether it's going to be under that or not. I know that CVSS comes from FIRST, and
Uh-huh.
EPSS is also a project of FIRST and one of their special interest groups. So it's a score between 0 and 1. It's a probability that something's going to be exploited within the next 30 days. And it takes into account um, threat intelligence, and it takes into account like recent events. It's not just a static score. We're finding that to be pretty useful in coming up with a reason why we'd want to have some particular vulnerability patch versus something else, even if the CVSS score isn't that high.
Right, right. And so then as the head of security, you're saying your role is to take all of these data and to show them to a business executive who then can decide, what do you do about this? Do you want to do something about this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times precisely that, but it's also me working within the business and within my peer group to say, here's the issue that I see, here's what I'm going to present, how can we work together to get these things fixed so I'm not throwing people under the bus or anything like that.
Fantastic. And as it shows there on screen, just if you do have questions for Ryan about Helix or about Hyperproof or about Ryan's background, please do drop them in the chat on either YouTube or on LinkedIn. We will see those come in on our screens here. And so Ryan, you're working in an interesting space right now, which is genetic technology, and there's some recent news events in that environment that
Yes.
keep popping up all over my news feeds. So could you share some insights with the viewers about how emerging technologies are really shaping the way that genetic data are being protected and managed on an ongoing basis?
Yeah. So, w- one of our biggest challenges, of course, is just the sheer volume of data. We're talking about petabytes of data that is stored in Amazon in S3 buckets, or whatever else we have out there. Sorry, my screen just locked.
Oh, you're still on here. I can
Okay.
see you just fine.
Okay. Um, so the big challenge that we have, though, is because it's in a cloud environment, things can move around without a tremendous amount of visibility sometimes. So we want to make sure that we have tools in place that can tell us where the data exists currently and where it's moving. So think like sort of DLP like tools,
Hmm.
or data discovery tools. Um, but sort of traditional ones don't necessarily work very well. You really want to find stuff that is cloud native and works seamlessly with your cloud environment. So, for example, the tools that were in place, or we were evaluating for a while, required like logins to RDS databases
Hmm.
and that sort of stuff, and EC2 instances or whatever it might be. But that's not realistic in a lot of ways because it would need access into the environment, from an IP level versus an API level.
Hmm.
So the tools that we're looking at now and that we're implementing now are API native integrations with Amazon. So they just use the native tools in the native interfaces within Amazon to pull and glean information from those repositories. So this is all very new technology.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, it's very cool. um, and it is, you know, it's new, right? So it's not going to work perfectly, and it's not going to have all the bells and whistles that you may be used to. But as long as you have your requirements and you're able to, again, sort of build rapport with the cloud team, right? Because they don't want to install agents on everything. They don't want to have password management on all their RDS clusters. They want something that's they're going to be able to give a role to, hopefully in a CloudFormation template or something like that,
Hmm.
and it's going to be able to just do its work in a very short amount of time, without a whole lot of intervention from their team.
And now that's in the new environment, which you say is on
Yep.
cloud for you. But yeah, well, prior to joining Hyperproof, I was in the defense industrial base, and I remember having IoT devices that, you think, well, it's a $30,000, what was it, a electron scanner, micro electron? It
Yeah.
was some kind of fancy, shiny object, and it runs Windows XP. And so you go, well, that we can't put a client access license on there. We can't upgrade it, but we've still got to have it because we do things with it, or presumably somebody did something with it. I never understood what it was, but
Yeah.
electrons maybe. I just watched Oppenheimer. Maybe that's what we were doing. Anyway, what are the challenges that you're facing, really, and you and your team are facing in maintaining compliance with a standard like HIPAA or like SOC 2, where they really do push for modern operating systems and a good asset inventory when you've got a lab environment where you've got IoT devices, presumably, that are essential, but traditional security controls just don't work, and so they're very difficult to secure.
Yeah. Well, on that end, I've seen Oppenheimer as well, and I thought it was very confusing. Um, so
Yeah, yeah. The narrative was a bit all over the map. Soundtrack
yes,
was good though.
it
Wow.
was. It was. Um, so this is something that, you have to wind up. You have to get comfortable with. Again, it's about exploring the environment and understanding what it is that you've got and what you're comfortable with allowing to happen within the environment. So, as an example, yeah, certainly we have some very expensive instruments that aren't just very expensive sitting there, but they're very expensive when they're running.
Hmm.
So we have a couple of these devices that once they start running, they'll run for 24 to 48 hours, and every time they run, it costs $20,000 in consumables. So if any sort of hiccup happens, due to, say, a process being stopped by our EDR or something like that,
Hmm.
then you can lose a lot of money in that case. So we've taken the approach of sort of vaccinating most of the environment, but not necessarily absolutely everything. So like on those devices, we don't run an EDR, but we do, work with the manufacturer to get, as much security tooling and controls in place as we can. So think, traditional sort of host-based firewalls in place, disabling services that are unnecessary, and they're usually pretty willing to work with us on those, just because of the sheer investment involved, and they want us to be successful as well. Um, but then there's all the, like, truly IoT devices that have no management whatsoever, right? So think of things like temperature sensors,
Hmm.
cheap, I mean, relatively cheap devices, that you don't really know what's going on with them, and there's no way to really secure them. You can't install an agent on them. You can't do anything really with them. So you just have to isolate those as best you can. Um, and this again comes down to understanding the environment better, and understanding what's happening. So you may have some devices that you can segment off the network because of the use case. They don't need to be on the network per se, um, or they can be on a separate hub or a switch that's in a wiring closet, and they're isolated. So a lot of it comes down to also just understanding the business requirements. We have a lot of devices that are IoT,
Hmm.
that have network ports that normally you'd plug a network jack into the back of it and be on your way, but there's no business need for it. And so those ports are just unplugged. They're not on the network at all.
All right, and I've got some familiarity with this as well, having worked with telcos, where the vendor absolutely bans you from doing any kind of updates or modifications to those devices. Is that how you're really approaching those security risks associated with those IoT devices in the lab, to them off as much as possible and make sure that they have a business reason for network connectivity? Or is there anything else you're doing, knowing that the manufacturers will say, well, you just voided your warranty because you tampered with it?
Yeah. Uh, it's about understanding the risk and then presenting it to leadership. We have the folks who are responsible for the lab and the operational environment. They need to understand what's in their environment as well, and they need to understand what the risks are to that environment, and they need to accept those. So again, it's not up to us to accept the risk. It's up to us to identify those,
Hmm.
to escalate them as appropriate, recommend compensating controls. Then they can work ultimately with the manufacturers to hopefully either choose better products in the future, if those even exist. In some cases, they don't, of course, or generate improvements on those devices. Um, we have done a pretty good job of network segmentation.
Hmm.
So that, I think, is another good strategy to enforce if you can. But it it's difficult to scale, I understand.
Got it. And with that, I want to take a couple questions that we've seen now come in from the audience. So this first one actually is pretty timely. I referred to it obliquely, opaquely. I mentioned it without mentioning it,
Mhm.
but somebody here is asking about it specifically. So in light of the 23andMe breach, which for those of you who aren't familiar with, was caused by password reuse, essentially by consumers reusing their credentials from, I don't know, some other website
Yeah.
on 23andMe's website. But in light of the 23andMe breach, how has your organization's approach to identity and access management evolved? And what role is that really taking in your cybersecurity strategy?
Well, we're in a very different type of business than 23andMe, so we're not really a. I mean, we do have participants in our program, but the information is all de-identified. So the idea, certainly there was the credential stuffing attack that happened, and then once people got into the 23andMe network, they were able to see what people were sharing with other people.
Hmm.
Um, that that sort of business use case doesn't even exist in our world. And if there is a sharing component, it's not to other users, it's to researchers, and it's all completely de-identified using industry standard de-identification techniques. Um, but pertinent to like the identity and access management question, um, we take two tacks. One is if people do want to log into the system and they're not currently integrated with their EHR,
Hmm.
um, then they can create an account on our platform after they've been invited to it. And we use Okta, so
Okay.
they've had lots of news articles as well, of course.
Yes, they certainly have.
Yeah,
I think that their responses sometimes have not been, like, their marketing response hasn't been good as their technical response.
no, 100% agreed. Um, so uh, it has changed what I shouldn't say that it's changed anything. We already enforce multi-factor.
Hmm.
And we did that to begin with. But it will wind up changing, I think, what some of our recommendations are. I mean, I think passkeys have a big promise in that area. I don't honestly know whether Okta supports passkeys at this point, but that's one of the things that I'm going to be looking into.
Yeah, I'm starting to just in my own personal life start to move to passkeys in addition to a hardware-based authenticator. So the hardware-based authenticator can get me into the passkey store. The passkey store can get me into other things. So
Yeah,
yeah, that is probably further than most consumers go, but it's probably where a lot of business is going.
100%. I think that we've definitely moved a significant portion of our systems over to hardware only based MFA. We use Apple exclusively, so we've either got Touch ID or YubiKeys that we give out.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah, so passkeys are great for consumers, though. I think that it's still a sort of a confusing experience, to be honest.
Yeah.
But hopefully that'll iron itself out in a little while.
Sure hope so. Well, I want to take another question from the audience as opposed to talking about my own journey with passkeys, which I'm sure is, eh, eh, you know. But here's a question from the audience about the what. Hmm, I think this one possibly matters. You've only said you're on AWS, so we'll try this one, and maybe you've got an opinion. But what are the financial implications of adopting multi-cloud strategy for enhanced security and compliance, particularly in the context of protecting genetic data under HIPAA?
I don't know what the financial implications would be of that, other than I'm sure it would add cost. um, as far as protecting the data
Hmm.
and storing it in multiple locations, that is an added cost. Transfer fees and that sort of stuff would add up, particularly when you're talking about petabytes of information that you may want to replicate between your cloud environments.
So in that case,
Um,
you're more of an advocate of going with just a single cloud as opposed to this idea of multi-cloud.
I'm very lucky that the business is all in on one cloud infrastructure and it doesn't want to do multi-cloud for sure. I feel bad for folks who have to deal with multi-cloud environments. I mean, we do have like tiny little bits and pieces,
Hmm.
but the bulk is in Amazon, and so I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah, yeah, no, I can completely relate to that. I remember, I mean, you've been doing this long enough to remember the '90s and to have been working during that period of time. And I remember reading a report on organizations that said, hey, this is our tech stack. You will work with our tech stack. This is our tech stack. This is the only stuff we use. Anything else is an exception. And other companies said, pizza boxes look cool. Let's put those all into our data center and let's run
Mhm.
every possible technology. And then you go fast forward 5 years, and the companies where they really leaned in hard into a specific technology stack had less severe and less frequent security breaches than those that really said, here is a panoply of technology. And the reason why, and this is the part that I find interesting in response to your like multi-cloud versus single cloud, the companies that had taken the time to learn, like you said at the top about threat hunting and getting more insight into what normal looks like in an environment, when they had a not a monolithic tech stack, but a defined tech stack, they really understood their environment. Whereas the companies where they just went willy nilly, which I think we're seeing right now with Shadow IT and Shadow AI,
Mhm.
they just didn't know what normal looked like. They didn't have that deep bench of expertise
Yeah.
to understand. Here's what a good day looks like. Here's what a bad day looks like. Has that been kind of your experience too with going to single cloud?
Well, 100% agreed. Yeah. I mean, all you have to do is open the console on another cloud provider and just poke around a little bit and understand that it's going to take a long time for you to learn another technology. I'm all about learning if the business wants to do that for sure.
Hmm.
But yeah, and it's not just the security team, right? It's everybody who has to learn a lot more information to understand, like you just said, what's sort of normal and what tools are in place and what can you use and is there feature parity between all of these different things. So uh, if you do lean into one tech stack and you invest not just money
Hmm.
with it, but time as well, I think it pays off. We have a pretty strong account team with Amazon, right? So we can ping them when we have questions. We get on calls with them to talk about security architectures. Um, it just makes it a lot easier when you have some people to ask and advocate for you when you want to implement new technologies.
Yeah, so it's less about the merit or the one is better or worse than the other. It's
Yeah,
more just about the people who are actually operating the controls behind the scenes, knowing what to do, right?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I there are clearly some crappy technologies out there, right? But I think that if you have a lot of stuff that is just good enough,
Hmm.
you're going to be able to use kind of use the Pareto principle and say like, we got 80% of our environment covered. The rest of this 20% is going to cost a lot more money if
Hmm.
we want to do this, or we can just rely on some additional, let's put layer some additional types of controls in those environments. I go back to like running traditional EDR on EC2. Yeah, it's great until you start running Docker on EC2, and then you start to move those into Fargate and Lambda. Then it's not there anymore. You can't run it on anything. So what are you going to do now? You have to learn something new. You have to use a new technology
Yeah, I
that
want
you're
to
not
talk
used to.
about that because it seems like Amazon comes up with a new product every few minutes,
Hmm.
and they kill the old ones occasionally, and they all have funny names, um, increasingly. But
Yes.
not as bad as Microsoft's new vulnerability like
Oh,
naming for threat groups. That's we're just going
no.
to set that
Microsoft
aside.
just renames their products randomly, it seems.
They
So,
rename their products, and they also rename like the APT groups is what I'm thinking of. Some
mhm.
of their names that like there's one that's a trumpet, and it's just comedy gold in my world. But let's talk about AWS, right? So how is this evolution? Because you've talked about it a little bit about these AWS services. How does that really influence your approach to asset visibility and security management? Because we know we can't secure what we don't know we have or what we can't see.
Yeah. Um, well, like you just mentioned, they're coming out with new features all the time, right? And so usually, if you want something implemented in Amazon and it's not there yet, you can try to code it yourself. You could hire somebody to code it. You can have people on your team to code it, or you can kind of just wait it out until they've implemented something that's going to be acceptable for your use case. So, as a great example, we have S3 bucket object access logging turned on a couple of buckets. Not everything, because it's a tremendous amount of data, right?
Hmm.
And so we have cloud. We use CDK, which generates cloud formation templates, which then funnels all that information into a single account. That's great. Well, they just came out with a security lake, and it's going to do all that stuff automatically for us with a click. So we're not afraid to throw all that work out and use the native AWS tools if they're going to be better for us.
Hmm. That's ideal. And so then I'm hearing there's also some automation here, which I'm always in favor of.
Yeah.
How are you effectively using it, and what role would you really say automation plays in enhancing that asset visibility in both your AWS but also your on-premises environment? Because I know that's like the stuff that you've got on AWS can't, well, I don't think it can be doing an asset inventory of all those manky IoT devices and
No.
on-premises devices you have.
Yeah, there might be something that I'm unaware of, but to your point, I'm not. I don't think so. So yeah, we generated a list of requirements because we wanted to have a tool that could do asset visibility for us in both
Hmm.
cloud and on-prem. And you just have to find tools that are out there that are doing it, because you're not the only company in the world that wants this. So there are things out there that will integrate seamlessly with Amazon, Azure, GCP, Oracle, whatever it might be, in the ways that I described. API native integrations that pull from existing cloud configuration resources into a centralized repository. And they also do the same thing for on-premise. So they'll
Hmm.
sit there and just look at the network traffic, for example. So in some cases, you need to implement some technology to span ports, traffic, that sort of stuff, or um, not in our case, but in some cases install an agent or something like that. But um, it's new technology. The traditional stuff that people have been deploying for years is probably not going to work. A lot of times, it's got to be these new players, these new startups that are coming out with new technologies.
That makes a lot of sense. Are there any best practices you can share with us, Ryan, about organizations that want to improve their asset visibility in both their AWS and their on-premises infrastructure?
I mean, I think really the best idea is to uh, demo things and do really um, maybe not super detailed, but definitely do a POC to make sure that you see it actually works for your environment, and see how easy or hard it is to implement. And if it is a good tool, then the cloud team is going to be like, this thing looks awesome, and
Hmm.
your on-premise lab team is going to be like, this thing looks great, and it'll work for you. I can promise you there are tools out there that'll do it. That will be uh, also beneficial to them when they want to find something. So, like the asset inventory tool that we're using right now, the IT team actually paid for. We brought it in to do like a POC. They liked it so much, they're like, we want to pay for it because this
Hmm.
gives us visibility into our infrastructure we had never seen before.
Hmm.
So, and it also gets all of our cloud stuff as well.
I also want to just double click on the word asset there because I realized I threw that out and you and I didn't agree on what is an asset. And to me, I tend to think in terms of like how Sarbanes-Oxley defines assets and systems, and that they tend to be like a collection of stuff that does a thing. That's your formal business talk of the day. Is that how you're defining assets, so that it's around business systems and business owners, or are you still thinking of assets as being distinct, like this is a switch, this is a router, this is a span port, this is an AWS
Mm.
Lambda instance?
It really depends on the environment, but generally speaking, because I mentioned before, in Amazon, we're a very serverless sort of modern technology stack. A
Hmm.
lot of the assets correspond to specific services that we provide inside the environment. So the asset for, you know, whatever service it might be is going to have a Lambda function. It's going to have a GitHub repository. It's going to have a couple of different, maybe a DynamoDB database or a S3 bucket, excuse me, or something like that. So it's going to be all part of that service. And similarly to the on-premise stuff, we have groupings of assets. So like these are all genetic sequencers, and these are all Hamilton robots, and these are all accessioning PCs or whatever they might be. So we're sort of grouping them in spaces like that. I don't know if that helps, but
And now I'm just
that's
deadly
kind of
curious if the Hamilton robots sing as well as they do on stage and on Broadway.
I haven't
Please
seen it
tell me
yet,
that's a
but
thing you have.
I mean, that's a good question. I need to talk with the manufacturer and see what they can do about that.
I think that'd be fantastic if you could have a little Broadway production going on in your lab. Now that might be distracting to the lab techs, but who knows? I know some lab techs, and it's sometimes a bit dull.
It's pretty dull.
Yeah. But I want to take an audience question here, and it's going back to incident response preparedness. And it's around return on investment, actually. So that's an interesting question. So how you're evaluating your ROI, your return on investment associated with doing incident response, including if there are any financial benefits you've been able to convey to your executive team or to your leadership around the benefits of doing tabletop exercises.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that I've been able to identify any financial benefits per se.
Okay.
But we do have pretty strong leadership support from the top down on conducting tabletops on an annual basis, not just incident response tabletops, but we also are looking to do BCP tabletops and finance like wire fraud tabletop exercises as well, because they participated in them enough to understand the benefits of it. So they can see what it is that the learnings are, and how, if you're just practicing and you're getting that muscle memory down, everybody's working cross-functionally and collaboratively to basically protect the business. So that's where I think one of the areas where I would explore ROI. I suppose I haven't really thought about it that way, but the incident response preparedness kind of goes also back to what I do with respect to threat hunting, right? So, and again, I haven't done all of this work yet, but my plan is for the next quarter or so to implement there's some tooling that Amazon folks have published that automates a big chunk of the incident response process, including standing up separate forensics accounts and that sort of stuff. So what I'm going to be doing is using those to demonstrate like what we've learned from those exercises and what we've been able to find from a high level. Like maybe it's data leaving the company, maybe it's some weirdness, maybe it's whatever it might be, and implementing policies to prevent that if we get leadership buy-in.
Okay, so it's really less about return on investment and more about you can show at least that you're reducing the potentiality of an impact.
Right. I mean, I think that they do understand that if you don't prepare and you don't practice, then when something does happen, it's going to be a very big uplift, right?
Yeah, I think that's an understatement of very big uplift.
Yes.
Oh dear me. All right. Well, with that, I think we've hit the top of the show. So I want to thank you for being on the show today, Ryan. And to the audience, if you're watching this and you know somebody that we should have on the show, or alternatively, if you're that person and you think, hey, I should be on that show, do drop a note in the comments, or just DM me directly. There's a QR code to our LinkedIn page up there. And with that, Ryan, I really want to thank you again for joining us, and thank our audience again for tuning in for today's live stream.
Thanks, Kayne. It was wonderful chatting with you.